Well, howdy, booze and ghouls. It's once again spooky season, which means it is time for my annual Halloween series. This year, I'm doing one of my favorite genres, which is Weird Westerns. Weird Westerns, for those of you not familiar, this is a genre of westerns that is combined with horror, science fiction, fantasy, something like this. So Wild Wild West and the supernatural. In this case, I'm going to be primarily focusing on horror stories. So in this video for my Halloween series 2023, we're going to talk about Robert Conway's film Skinwalker. This is a film in which a version of American Indian mythology, specifically Navajo mythology, is used as the basis for the horror. Set in the Old West in Arizona, 1887, I want to say. I forget exactly what year the film said at the beginning. But basically, we start with two hunters, cowboys, prospectors. We don't really know what they are. They're just two dudes wandering around through the mountains of Arizona, and they come upon a Navajo or Apache burial site. They're not 100% sure, but one of the guys steals an amulet from the body of the person laid out there. The other guy, for his part, is like, hey man, maybe don't do that. That's a pretty fucked up thing. Don't steal from the dead and don't desecrate native burial sites. Incidentally, that is the ethically correct thing to do. And in the US and Canada, we still actually sometimes desecrate native burial sites, particularly if there's mineral resources that we want under them. So, yeah, good ethical lesson from this filthy, walking through the woods fucking cowboy in the 1880s. Nonetheless, his friend takes the amulet, and then that night, the guy who was like, don't fuck with that grave, gets bitten by a snake. He thinks it's a rattlesnake, so he sucks the poison out of his foot. They go back to sleep, and then in the middle of the night, the guy who robbed the grave wakes up, and his friend is like, and he like rolls this guy over. He's like, what's going on? And the guy's bleeding out of his eyes. He's bleeding out of his mouth. He's bleeding out of his nose. Fucking crazy shit. And then this dude dies. But then he gets back up and he's like coming at this other guy, and he like scratches his face up. And the guy who robbed the grave like stabs him through the eye, and the dude goes down. At which point, the guy who robbed the grave gets up and he just like starts stumbling through the woods because he's just had this crazy experience. And he comes upon these two women who are out finding firewood. He is all woozy and shit, and they basically like take him prisoner. And the dude who lives in this house that they take him to, he has cordial relations with the local Native Americans. And so he is going to turn over the amulet plus this dude who stole it to them to try and, again, strengthen that relationship he has with them. While that is going on, the guy who robbed the grave is starting to experience some concerning symptoms along the same lines as what his friend had experienced. While all of this is going on, we have another storyline intertwined with this. We have Boscombe and Riggs, who are two marshals, Boscombe is the marshal, Riggs is his deputy, and they kidnap a woman named Maisie, who is the wife of a wanted outlaw. There's a reward for her as well, but really they want this outlaw. So they the plan basically is they're going to take her, and when these outlaws come, they're going to ambush them. Things don't entirely go to plan, and they end up... So the guy who was going to the local Native American tribe to return the amulet and this dude, he actually gets attacked by what appear to be Apache warriors. That's my rough guess, but I'm not 100% sure based on the clothing, the equipment, and the patterns on their face paint. I think that's Apache, but it could be Navajo. I'm not sure. But he gets attacked, and they put an arrow through his shoulder, and they come up with a device that puts basically an arrowhead right under his jaw and the bottom part against his chest, so he can't lower his head all night. And he's trying to convince them that he was going to return this amulet and that they should bring him to their chief, Red Feather, who he was going to see. They are not convinced by this. And then eventually Boscom, Riggs, and Maisie come upon them. Boscom shoots the two Native Americans, but one of them shoots him with an arrow. And so now Riggs and Maisie have these two injured guys. And they've started to sort of work together on this in order to survive. The outlaws, Willard and his two dudes, they come to the cabin where... Well, okay, so it's complicated because these storylines are intertwined. So the guy who'd robbed the grave, he dies. The women at the cabin are basically like, well, that's not good, but what are you going to do? Then they later go back out to get some salt out of the storage unit the storage shed where his body was, and his body's gone. The three outlaws show up at their cabin and are basically like, hey, you can either give us some food and stuff, or we can rob you of your food and stuff. And so they're like, well, okay, I guess you can have some food and stuff. Willard's companion, he's got two dudes with him. The one who kind of doesn't play that big a role, he ends up getting murdered pretty quickly by the dead guy who had robbed the grave. Willard's other friend cuts that dude's head off. So now they've got... So basically the long and the short of it is the core portion of the movie is basically just this Skinwalker's disease, parasite thing passes from person to person. Which, from my understanding of how Skinwalkers work, and I don't have an in-depth understanding of this, that's not really how Skinwalkers work. This is more like a zombification plague, right? Where the germ, or whatever it is, of being a zombie is passed from person to person through bites or scratches. This is really what that looks like, more than what I think traditionally Skinwalkers are in Navajo mythology, because as I understand it, they are witches or sometimes demons, something like this, that are able to change their shape. The only real indication we ever have in this film that the Skinwalker, the queen, this woman who was dead, who is now the Skinwalker, the only real indication we have that she can change her shape is the snake bite at the beginning. And for that, we have to assume that she had changed into a snake to bite this guy to pass on this zombification possession thing. But we don't really get an indication that, like, she is taking on the shapes of traditional Navajo figures, like wolves or coyotes or things like this. Things that would be very traditional for a Skinwalker forms that would be very traditional for a skinwalker to take on, we don't get much indication that she's doing that. We do get a version of her at the very end of the movie, because we have a shaman who shows up who is trying to basically put her back into her body and send the skinwalker power back to the spirit world. They more or less succeed at this. Most of the people die. Really, the only people who survive are Riggs, Maisie, and Nellie, who's the youngest of the three women at the cabin, who, incidentally, we find out are all this dude's wives. He's got three wives, the youngest of whom is 13, and the other people in the film pretty rightly judge him for that, because that is a bad business. Don't do that. Don't marry 13-year-olds. If you want to have multiple wives or multiple husbands and those people want to all be married to you, I'm not going to judge you for that, but don't marry children. It's not good. Don't do it. I'm going to judge you for that. And these other cowboys and whatnots, outlaws and random people are going to judge you for that as well. So be warned. Anyway, that's a digression. So basically, Riggs, Maisie, and Nellie, the youngest of the three wives, all survive. The shaman survives, but Nellie kind of gets attacked by the skinwalker in her sort of spirit form, we might say. She's got this like deer skull, antlers, feather regalia, but she's basically just a shadowy form. And she's like coming at Nellie's throat when she gets thrust back into her body or into the spirit world or whatever it is. And so Riggs takes Maisie and Nellie down off the mountain, takes them to a town, buys them train tickets to California. He's decided he's not going to turn Maisie in. He's going to give her a head start, which means he's probably not going to pursue her, mostly because he likes her. Then we read in a newspaper that the U.S. Army, famous for its sensitive treatment of indigenous peoples, has been called in to remove all of the natives from the mountain. Yeah, great stuff. Way to go, U.S. The group of soldiers come upon the shaman, who's still sort of, I guess, standing guard over the body of this dead leader. Incidentally, we do get the story of her. She apparently was this great leader who brought together a group of Navajo, Apache, Pueblo, just all different nations and tribes. She brought together a sort of a mixed band of people and brought them to this mountain. But she started to dabble in the black arts or something like this. And so the current chief, Red Feather, led an uprising against her, and they managed to overthrow her. The movie ends with these soldiers pointing their guns at this shaman and basically being like, "Get off this mountain." And the shaman takes the amulet from off the body, the amulet that prevented her from rising as a skinwalker, hands it to one of the soldiers and says, "The mountain is yours." And then we actually end and back on the train with Nellie and Maisie sitting across from one another. Nellie has her face sort of down like this, and Maisie says, "Nellie, are you all right?" And we can see out of the corners of her eyes, Nellie has started bleeding, and she turns her face and just scream. The skinwalkers scream. Now, it's not 100% clear why, as soon as this skinwalker has rearisen, it has manifested in Nellie rather than in the soldier who is taking this amulet, which is kind of what happened the first time. Probably because the skinwalker in its spirit form almost killed Nellie. But anyway, so the movie itself, it's a complicated interwoven plot, but actually, the storyline as such is reasonably straightforward. The thing that I think is striking and problematic about it is the whole linking of Native Americans with supernatural or spiritual violence, right? The old Scooby-Doo, is this place buried on a Native American, or is this place built on a Native American burial ground shtick, is really kind of problematic, actually, because in the US and Canada, there are long, long histories of severe anti-Indigenous prejudice. And part of that has been rooted in this sense that, like, Native Americans are somehow demonic or unchristian at the very least. And so those sorts of elements are really problematic in terms of evoking and maintaining anti-Indigenous prejudice. And I think while Skinwalker has some sympathetic elements to it, like the end portion where the U.S. Army is, for no apparent reason, called in to remove all of these indigenous peoples from their land, there's still some really negative elements to this. And again, the association of indigenous people with black magic, demonic violence, things like this, is troubling. It links indigenous cultures with these dark and dangerous forces in ways that support anti-indigenous prejudice.